Are they just deceitful? Is that in their nature that they're 100% deceitful? Do they have an agenda that they're trying to pass across to you? I think that's half the problem.
That's Ralph Ellis. He's answering a question that I asked him about the nature of, you might say, academic guardians of accepted paradigms. Why do they not confront obvious anomalies in their thought, obvious lacuna in their logic? How can they stare a big truth that rubs against the grain of what they profess to believe and which they sort of ram down the throats of the rest of us, and they just balk? They don't deal with it. They don't even properly debunk the things that would seem to undermine their whole way of viewing the world. There's a lot of subjects that are like this. My favorite example is usually Keynesianism in economics. After World War I, Britain went on the gold standard at the old parity. This required prices to downwardly adjust so that you could reach a new equilibrium, or at least a moving equilibrium. But the unions wouldn't let it, and the politicians didn't dare go against the unions, so there was a depression. Brits didn't have the great recovery that Americans had after World War I. And this was because of a political problem. Keynes knew this. All economists knew this. This was not a secret. And yet all the elaborate structure of Keynesianism was built on this basic evasion of a standard problem in economics. So Keynes invented wage rigidities while supporting, de facto, artificial rigidities to wages. Unions wouldn't let nominal wage rates go down, and thus there was dislocation in the economy. So that's why I say Keynesianism is a lie, or based on an evasion at best. It turns out that a remarkable number of disciplines are like this. And one of the ones that I've had to deal with in the last 20 years quite a bit is anthropogenic global warming. The CO2 story doesn't make a great deal of sense. There are many problems with it. And one that I've always dealt with, as most vexing, is that standard climate scientists will not explain and cannot explain the nature of the ice ages, the last one over a mere 13,000 years. So we're in this Holocene period, and we've had changes in climate the whole time, but it's been fairly mild for this Holocene. But the end of the Ice Age wasn't mild at all, and it turns out the Ice Ages always went in cycles. And if you're talking about catastrophic global warming now, but you can't explain Ice Ages, you don't really have much standing. So what do you do about people like this? Well, I dismiss them these days. I regard many of these people as either politicians or cult leaders or cult followers. It's just bizarre, but you cannot really treat them with the respect that you would expect them to deserve if they are in places of high authority. That's why I invited Ralph Ellis, the author of many books and a very interesting paper on Ice Age cycles, to talk with me. Now, the bulk of his books are on the history of Judaism and Christianity, in which he upends nearly everything we've all believed, believer and disbeliever alike. So he's quite a radical thinker, and he makes you think. So whatever you may think at first, second, or third about his ideas, you should at least give him a try. And certainly on the subject of global warming, this man has an important thesis to explain, because he understands, as far as I can tell, why ice ages cycle, why they don't behave like they should if CO2 or the Milankovitch cycles explained everything, because there's something else going on, and he actually, I believe, identified it. So I invited Ralph Ellis to talk with me on this podcast, the Locofoco Netcast. Yes, the sound of the match lighting is the logo of this podcast. We're lighting brush fires of the mind, as Samuel Adams put it, but let's not think politics so much as Ice Age and Exodus. So I'll cue up my conversation with Ralph Ellis, and you prepare to go deep into history. Well, my name is Timothy Virkala. I have a little podcast. It's mainly on politics, but I usually talk to philosophers and intellectual historians and people like that. And I've been reading you recently, your books. I've read 3 of them.
Oh, right.
And so it's a real honor to have you on the podcast.
That's always heartening that people actually read the books. That's, part of the intent.
And as I was reading, I realized that I had read you before, and that was your paper on the Ice Age cycles.
Ah, yes. A slight change of tack there, but it was very interesting.
And like everything else you do, you're upending what everybody else believes, it seems like.
Well, that's part of what I do. I look for subjects that are contentious, and I take a deep dive into them to see what the truth of it actually is. And that was one of these topics which I couldn't believe hadn't been sorted out. So I'd been doing a lot of chatting on websites about climate and CO2 and all of the scientific aspects of it. And I couldn't believe that nobody knew why ice ages occurred. And I was having an argument with a very eminent astronomer, and he said, well, the establishment view in that it's all controlled by orbital motions has to be correct. Even if there are large pieces of the puzzle missing, it has to be correct. And I thought, well, that's not a very scientific viewpoint. If you've got large elements of the theory missing, there's something wrong with it.
But it's very similar to how people think about global warming today. It has to be CO2, they say.
Yes, because they're only looking at one of the options. And therefore, if you only look at one option, that's what you're going to find. But correlation is not causation, as they always say in science. And so it was very inadequate, their descriptions, because, excuse me, the actual opposite occurs. So during the ice ages, when CO2 is at a maximum, the world cools. And when CO2 is at a minimum, the world warms. Now, it would not be doing that if CO2 was the primary feedback agent of temperature on the Earth. And so that's a conundrum, that was not explained in the scientific papers. And I read a lot of scientific papers because when I started delving into this, because I came up with my little theory, and this scientist came along and he said, well, if you want, we can make this into a proper scientific paper, but you've got to read these papers first to give the general picture of, what's known in this field. So he slapped down about 75 scientific papers and said, right, okay, read through those.
A weekend work, right?
And then we can, and then we can start somewhere. So I did. I sort of read through all of these papers. And nowhere in any of these papers did it sort out the problem which we were looking at, which is CO2 high causes cooling. Low CO2 causes warming. Totally the opposite of what they're saying today in the climate argument. And that's a very basic problem because it not only affects the ice ages, of course, it affects what we're doing currently with climate research. It's part and parcel of the same argument. Whatever you find for the ice ages affects us now. And so this had a great bearing on what was possible for current climate research. So I felt it was quite important, and it was important that we understood the truth, or at least another theory even if it wasn't the truth. It's another argument to take into account when you're looking at climate research.
And so what we're really talking about here is that the dominant paradigm has been that we are now experiencing global warming because of increased CO2, but ice ages occurred because of the Milankovitch cycle. Is that basically what they were saying?
Well, Milankovitch cycle with a CO2 feedback, but of course the CO2 feedback doesn't work. They keep saying it's a CO2 feedback that assists the Milankovitch cycle. I presume your viewers will know what Milankovitch is?
Well, maybe a very quick explanation would help.
A very quick overview. Okay, so the Earth has various orbital perturbations, you might call them. It has precession and it has obliquity changes. So the Earth has various wobbles, and the orbit changes from slightly elliptical down to circular. And these three aspects of the Earth's orbit changes the amount of insolation, they call it, so the amount of sunlight hitting the Earth in the higher latitudes. And these changes in the amount of insolation is called Milankovitch cycles. And they roughly go on a sort of 22,000 year cycle. But there are bigger perturbations as well, over 400,000 years and so on. So there are various oscillations in this amount of insolation that the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere gets. And these are called Milankovitch cycles. And they do coincide in some respects with the Ice Age cycle, but not fully. And that's the important point. So you can point to Milankovitch and saying, yes, okay, that is what is modulating the Ice Age cycle. But then, okay, it's missing several of the cycles within the Milankovitch cycle. So an Ice Age might be 80,000 years or 100,000 years. And that's one Ice Age cycle. But within that cycle, there might be 3 or 4 or 5 Milankovitch cycles, which have no effect on the Ice Age cycle. So it's very selective. It'll say, I'll take that Milankovitch cycle, but I'll ignore all of the rest of them.
It's slipping the gears in a sense.
Yes, slipping a gear, absolutely, in mechanical terms. And why should that happen? There was no explanation for why that should be happening. And that is not a full theory. You cannot say you know what controls Ice Age cycles unless you can explain that slippage. And that's what they hadn't done. And CO2 does not explain that slippage whatsoever.
Though your theory addresses CO2 in a rather interesting way.
Yes, it throws it out the window, basically.
Okay, that's one way of looking at it. So please explain.
Yeah. There is no need for a CO2 role in my theory of Ice Age modulation. And we know that is true of the Ice Ages because CO2 is a global gas. And the Ice Ages, so you would have an equal, the Milankovitch cycle, I call it the Great Year, because that is much more descriptive of what it is. So we have an annual year where it's warm in the north and cold in the south, and then 6 months later it changes around and it's cold in the north and it's warm in the south. Well, the Milankovitch cycle does exactly the same, but it does it over 22,000 years.
And that's the Zodiacal cycle, right? That's where we get the idea of the Zodiac, right?
Yeah, well, it changes that as well. It's not the same as the precessional cycle. That's over 26,000 years.
Okay, so that gets confusing. That has confused me in the past.
That gets confusing because you've got to take into account apsidal precession as well as normal precession. So I call it the Great Seasonal Year rather than the Great Year. So the Great Year is the precessional year. That is what we see with the precession of the equinox and the changing of the constellations. But the seasons, the Great Seasonal Year, is only 22,000 years long. This is because of another orbital perturbation of the Earth, which is difficult to explain, and you don't need to know why it happens. But it slightly changes the precessional year from 26,000 down to 22,000 years. But you still get this great seasonal year that is, say, 20,000 years long. And the seasons change exactly as they do during an annual year. So you'll get warming in the north for, say 6,000 years, and cold in the south. And then you'll have an autumn, and then you'll have the winter where it's cold in the north and warm in the south, and it swaps around exactly the same as a normal year does. And where were we on that? The warming period, so when we go into an interglacial, always happens on a northern great summer.
And that's because of the continents, right? Because there's more continents up in the north?
Yeah, but having done so, that excludes CO2 as a feedback agent, because CO2 is global.
Right.
If CO2 was the feedback agent, then you would have interglacial warming on some northern summers and on some southern summers, whichever ones it chose to have. But it doesn't do that. It always occurs on a northern great summer. Why? Well, you've already explained the answer is because all of the continents are in the northern hemisphere pretty much. And so there is a difference between the north and the south. And that difference is the ice sheets. Well, it's the continents, of course, but the continents breed ice sheets. And so the big difference between the north and the south during the ice ages is that you get ice sheets in the north and very, very, very small ice sheets in the south. And that is a big difference between the two hemispheres. And the difference is not CO2. The difference is albedo, surface albedo.
And that's the whiteness, basically, right? That's the reflectivity of the ice caps.
Of the Earth. And it's hugely reflective. I mean, in fresh snow, we're talking about 95% of the incoming insolation is rejected and thrown back into space. And if you think about the vastness of the northern continents and the ice sheets that used to go over them, that's a huge amount of summer, great summer insolation that's just being thrown away and never gets to the Earth, and it never warms the Earth. It has a huge difference on the warming effect on the Earth. And the difference is enormous. With CO2, they're sort of calculating 4 watts per meter squared or something over the interglacial warming period, which is 5,000 years. And I keep saying to these, because I've had arguments with climate scientists, I keep saying, well, that's a nonsense figure. You're giving 4 watts per meter squared over 5,000 years of warming for the interglacial. But that's not how warming works. Warming works by getting from one year to the next year with some warming, even if you say over a decade. So it's not 5,000 years. You don't suddenly get 5,000 years of warming all at once on the ice, 4 watts per square meter. You get, say, over a decade, you get a 500th of that amount, whatever it is. I can't calculate it in my mind immediately, but it's like 0.001 of a watt per square meter, which has to progress you in warming terms from one decade to the next decade to the next decade during the interglacial warming period. So quoting 4 watts per square meter is an absolute nonsense. You're getting, I calculated, less energy per square meter per decade than it takes for a bee to actually hold itself in level flight. That's how much extra energy you are putting into the ice sheets. It's nothing measured per decade. Absolutely nothing. And that's not going to melt the ice sheets. Whatever you say about Milankovitch and feedback agents, that's not going to melt the ice sheets. And what they did with albedo, most of the models don't include albedo, and if they do include albedo in the model, they include atmospheric albedo in terms of absorption of heat, of insolation, because a lot of dust in the atmosphere is a bit darker and it absorbs the insolation from the sun. So if you look at most of the models, they actually say albedo increases temperature. Increases temperature because of the dust absorbing all of the heat from the sun in the atmosphere. But
that's not quite albedo, is it?
Well, it is, because it's a lowering of the albedo.
Okay.
So you're actually sucking up some of the sunlight. It's the reverse albedo, as it were. But what none of these models do is include the surface albedo and the changes with having ice on the northern continents. And that can have an enormous effect on the amount of insolation, the amount of watts per square meter that you can have. And there was one paper, I think it was by Hansen, and in order to measure albedo, they took the sea level and they made the sea level proportional to the extent of the ice sheets, because obviously sea level goes down, ice sheets go up. And then they spread this albedo across the whole of the Earth. And they came up with something like 4 watts per square meter or something. And I wrote back and said, well, that's not what albedo is. You can't spread it all over the Earth and say that's what albedo is doing, surface albedo. What melts the snows in Canada each spring and summer? Is it the absorption of sunlight in Canada itself, or is it the ambient temperature in Argentina? You can't spread that effect over the whole Earth and say, I've calculated for albedo. It's just a complete nonsense. So what I did is calculated it there in situ in the northern hemisphere, and they normally measure this at about 65 degrees north because they think that's the most influential of the latitudes. And the insolation change, the absorption by having dust on the ice sheets, can be as much as 220 watts per square meter every year. So not spread over 5,000 years as they were doing with the CO2 warming, which was, if you measured it per decade, is only 0.001 or whatever watts per square meter per decade. This was 220 watts per square meter every single year because of the extra absorption of dust on the ice sheets.
So basically you're talking about is dirty ice sheets.
Dirty ice sheets. And if your listeners want to go and have a look at dirty ice sheets, go and look up the dark snow experiments. There was a team went up to to the Arctic, and were investigating dark snow. And they have a lot of very good pictures of what dark snow looks like. It's almost black in some occasions, mostly nowadays due to industrial soot from China getting onto the ice sheets. And it really turns it black. And, raw, fresh ice can be 95% albedo. This dark ice can go down to 20% albedo. So you've got a huge change in the amount of sunlight that's being captured by the ice, ablating the ice and melting the ice and, destroying the ice sheets. But your listeners might be saying, well, why are you talking about dust? How can dust affect the ice age cycle? Dust is constant, is it not? Well, actually, it's not. And this was the second thing I found within my research into this is dust is not constant. So dust increases just before every interglacial. And it's very, very, very marked. So you have a little bit of dust all the time. The ice age is 100,000 years long. So there's no dust, just a little tiny bit of dust at the bottom all the way along for like 90,000 years. And suddenly it goes up exponentially. And you get a huge amount of dust just before every interglacial. So there is a correlation there, a very, very strong correlation. And of course, it can be causal because we've already seen that a reduction of albedo on the ice sheets will cause warming and could destroy the ice sheets and therefore cause an interglacial. So there is a rational causal effect that could be generating interglacials. Which is interesting because nobody seems to be taking dust into account. I mean, these records and these charts and these graphs have been out there for tens of years. You know, the first of these, they all come from ice cores, mostly in Antarctica because there's a much longer record within Antarctica that goes back about 800,000 years. So it's a long record. And these, the first one I think was the Vostok, so we're probably talking the 1980s. So these records have been out there for at least 40 years. And the further and further down they dug, because Vostok only went back 400,000 years, and the latest one, which is Epica, goes back 800,000 years. And every single ice age cycle is associated with dust without fail, which is good prima facie evidence that dust is involved in this process somehow.
It certainly seems like a big clue.
You would expect it, but you know, of all of the papers I saw, none of them really addressed dust. There was 2 or 3 papers by a chap with a Russian-sounding name. I'll remember his Gabolsky or something. I'll remember his name in a minute. That did address dust and had dust in his model. And he said it was glaciogenic. So it was dust that was being formed by the scraping of the ice sheets on the surface of the Earth, and that was creating dust, and the dust got onto the ice sheets, which was a strange theory to have because they've done isotopic analysis on the dust in the northern ice sheets, because there is some dust also in the Greenland ice sheet. And the dust is not glaciogenic. It comes from the Gobi Desert.
And they determined that.
So, yeah, via isotopic analysis, so they know where it's come from.
So in Greenland, which is sort of halfway across the world from the Gobi Desert,
yeah,
they found Gobi Desert sand, basically.
Because it's the same dust as can be found on the lowest plateau in China. Okay. So they have this region in China which is to the east of the Gobi, and the Taklaman, I think they call it, desert, which is still a proper shifting sand desert today. And they have this lowest plateau, which is a large area of China, which is dust. And it's been formed by thousands and hundreds of thousands of years of dust. And the record there on the lowest plateau is exactly the same as the record in the ice sheets. And it's the same dust. So they've got 1 million years of dust deposits, all in perfect layers, all the way down this lowest plateau. And it conforms exactly with the dust that is on the Greenland ice sheet. So we know it's the same dust, and we know it conforms in the same pattern as well. Not very much dust, and then suddenly a lot of dust, and then not much dust, and then a lot of dust.
And you also explained why there would be a jump in the production of dust.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? In order to have a full theory, you need to have a comprehensive explanation of all of the aspects of it, which is why I didn't like the original CO2 theory to start with, because it didn't explain all of the aspects of the ice age cycle that we see. You know, these jumping gears, as you say, which is a very good description of what happens. Why should dust suddenly come up? Well, before we get there, this explains the jumping of gears. So we have this dust cycle, and if we dare say that the dust is causal rather than being caused by the interglacial, so if it's causal and it is actually generating the interglacial via lowering the albedo of the ice sheets, then this would explain the ice age cycle. So we have cooling, and cooling is caused by a great winter. And it cools very, very quickly. It cools over like 5,000 years, which is the sort of great winter time span. The world cools, and in Arctic terms, 12 degrees. It's centigrade we're talking here, of course. That's a big cooling. Within 5,000 years, 12 degrees, it goes straight down. And then it carries on for the next sort of, 80,000 years or whatever it is, and still getting colder and colder, obviously. Why would it do so? Why would we have this jumping of gears, as we say, these missing Milankovitch cycles? So after 5,000 years, the Milankovitch cycle goes into a great summer, and it starts to warm again in Milankovitch terms. But there is no temperature response. So the Earth does nothing. So we have great cooling caused by Milankovitch. Then we go into a great summer again. We have a lot of extra warming in the northern hemisphere, and the world does nothing. It continues to cool. Why the jumping of gears? Why the missing Milankovitch summer? Well, the dust explains it. Because the fresh ice is so reflective, 95% of that energy is being cast back out into space. And therefore, the Milankovitch Great Summer can't do anything. It can't get a grip on the ice. It can't get its energy into the Earth system. And therefore, you miss the Milankovitch Summer, the Great Summer. And then we go back into another great winter. Remember, these cycles are like 21,000 years each, which is cold again in the northern hemisphere, and it's back into ice age conditions. And then we have another great summer, and it does nothing because we have fresh ice in the northern hemisphere. And then it goes back into another great winter. And finally, we get loads and loads of dust. So now the ice is dirty. We get another great summer. And now we get interglacial warming, because now the sun can get a grip on this dirty ice. It can absorb all of that insolation. It can warm up, it can melt the ice, it can ablate the ice, and the ice disappears. Exactly as you see up in the north if you're in Canada or somewhere, and you see this dirty snow at the side of the road, and the dirty snow melts faster than the clean snow. Exactly the same process. And it's a local process. You can't spread this insulation out over the whole world. It's a local process on that patch of snow in that square kilometer in the northern hemisphere. And as I said before, with a lot of dust on that snow, you can have 220 watts per square meter of increased warming on that patch of snow. And remember, the dust, as it does in Canada now or whatever, if you're up in the north, that dust sits on the top of the snow. It doesn't get washed away. You can see it sitting on the top of the snow. And the snow melts underneath it, and it remains on the surface all the time. So it remains as a warming agent for as long as you like. As long as it's not covered up, it will be a warming agent in the next years and the next years, the next decades.
So why wouldn't a new snow just cover up what was already there?
Well, it does, but the next annual summer comes along. It melts that one year, and suddenly it's got It's got dust there again.
Oh, okay.
And that dust is going down through thousands of years. Remember, there is approximately 10,000 years of dust before we get warming. So it's not just the little surface of the ice sheet that is darkened. We've got 10,000 years of dust all the way through the top layers of the ice sheets. That's a lot of dust. And it's very easy to uncover that with an annual summer. So you'll have a bit of snow over the winter, of course, the annual winter. But then come annual spring and annual summer, some of that is exposed and it continues its warming because there is a thick, thick layer of dust now, almost covering the entire surface. And so as far as the sun is concerned, it looks like bare rock now, and it can warm it up very nicely and very easily. So that explains the Ice Age cycle, why it misses out some great summers and only gives warming on particular great summers. And there is another effect involved in there, in that it will only do that when you have a strong great summer.
Well, that's
so
the effect.
Not all great summers.
It's not low CO2. It's just strong great summer.
CO2 is not involved in this story at all. There is no CO2 element in this story whatsoever. Remember, CO2 lags the warming. So you get warming first, and then you get CO2. If CO2 was the feedback agent, it should be leading the warming, but it doesn't. It actually follows the warming. And the reason that the CO2 follows the warming is because warmer seas exhale CO2. So as you get an interglacial and the seas warm, CO2 will naturally increase because it's being exhaled from the oceans. And so it's consequential. It's not causal. It's following the warming. And so CO2 is not involved in this story whatsoever. You could take it out of the argument completely. It's just non-existent. The reason why we get these great summers every roughly 80 or 100,000 years is because of the eccentricity of the Earth. And that causes a cycle upon a cycle within the Milankovitch cycle, so that some great summers are extra strong and some are weak. And that follows about a 100,000 year cycle. And so if you've got a weak great summer, even if you had some dust on the ice sheets, it's not necessarily going to cause warming because it's a weak great summer. What you need is a really strong great summer, and that's going to produce your warming. And that only occurs every roughly 100,000 years. And that's why we see this 100,000 year pattern within the warming cycle. So what you need for warming is dust on the ice sheets, a nice thick layer, 10,000 years perhaps of dust on the ice sheets, and a very strong great summer. Then you will get warming, then you will get an interglacial. Those are the two requirements that you require.
Now, what are the effects of some Holocaust, a meteor impact, comet impact, or any of those kind of things? Does that have anything to do with dust at all, or?
No, there is no evidence for that in the record. The only evidence there is within this cycle is we do get some sudden peaks. Not very visible in the Antarctic record, because the Antarctic record, well, it's miles away from the northern hemisphere, so it doesn't have all of the effects down there. But in the northern record, in the Greenland ice sheets, we do have these records of sudden warming, sudden cooling. And by sudden warming, I mean 10 degrees of warming in 10 years. I mean, they're talking about half a degree nowadays. During the Ice Age, they had some really rapid warming, 10 degrees in 10 years, and then cooling again back to the Ice Age. So these are very transient little spikes in the warming, and within the Ice Age. And I have put these down to, because there was a very good paper on these spikes, and they were all associated with combustion products. And so it seems likely that the sudden spikes are caused by global forest fires, combustion products,
Right.
putting carbon, and carbon is the greatest of absorbers of sunlight, putting carbon upon the ice sheets. And therefore, again, nothing to do with CO2, because they'll say, okay, burning forest fires puts CO2 into the atmosphere. Yeah, but more than it putting CO2 into the atmosphere, it puts carbon on the ice sheets. And it allows for 10 years, 50 years of warming, and then it goes back into cold conditions once that carbon has been washed off the ice sheets. And so we get these little spikes all the way during the Ice Age. This is just for the Holocene, because we don't have a record of it from Antarctica.
And are we talking really about the Younger Dryas here? Is that kind of what you're trying to explain?
No, the Younger Dryas is definitely a meteor impact, but we'll go into that a little bit later.
Okay.
But what we haven't explained, and what you asked for before, is why do we get dust? And that's a real conundrum. Why should dust only appear every 100,000 years? How can dust be tied to the orbital cycles? I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Why would you get dust? And that took a long time, and we were stalled on the paper at that point, because the paper didn't explain everything. So we sat there for several months mulling over this. And finally I realized that warming is caused by CO2, but not by CO2 getting too high, but because CO2 was getting too low. So it's low CO2 that causes warming. Again, total reverse of what they're seeing today. Why should it do so? Well, because there is an unspoken truth, which nobody will mention in the modern world, in that CO2 is the most important gas in the atmosphere. CO2 is plant food. Without CO2, all life on Earth dies. And what they won't tell you is we were very near to the extinction event. Even in the modern world, we were quite close to the extinction event where all life on Earth dies. We were hovering around the sort of 240 parts per million mark in the pre-industrial age. If you get down to 150 parts per million, all the plants die. And if all the plants die, all of the animals die. The only thing left on Earth will be mushrooms. And they'll have a few million years to chew up the old vegetation matter before they die as well. Without CO2, all life on Earth dies. But of course, it doesn't all die at once, because CO2, the partial pressure of CO2, decreases with altitude. And so you will get death at higher altitude before you get death at lower altitude. And just looking at it, if you go up to the tree line, the critical figure is about 190 parts per million, where plants can still survive roughly down at sea level, but at high altitude, all the plants start to die because of a lack of CO2, because the partial pressure of CO2 of all gases will be lower at that altitude. And that explains why we get sudden amounts of dust. So CO2 goes down during the Ice Age. So the CO2 levels within the atmosphere follow the temperature precisely. And that's why people have said, CO2 is controlling temperature, because they follow each other exactly. But remember, correlation is not causation. In the modern world, the rate of climb of CO2 seems to be proportional to temperature, both rising at the same time. But the rise in milk production in the world also is correlated to temperature. But that doesn't mean that milk causes temperature rises. Correlation is not causation. You've got to have a way in which the one can affect the other. And so, okay, we have CO2 following temperature during the Ice Age. As the temperature drops, so does CO2 drop. As temperature rises, CO2 rises. And you can say, well, there's a correlation. Yeah, but there's not causation. Because what they won't tell you is that dust also follows temperature, and it follows CO2. So if you do a graph of CO2 versus dust, they correlate precisely, but inversely and logarithmically. So you've got to plot the dust logarithmically against CO2, and it's a perfect match. But because it's logarithmic, if you get a small drop in CO2, it makes a huge rise in dust. So why is CO2 controlling dust? There's a correlation, but is it causation? What's the mechanism by which CO2 causes dust? And the answer is that CO2 is plant food. If there is a lack of CO2, the plants die, the earth is now exposed, and the wind can now take that earth, that dust, and push it across the lowest plateau in China. This happens at high altitude first, not at low altitude. So what we're looking for is high altitude plateaus that can be starved of CO2, and therefore turn into CO2 deserts. And so we have this wonderful term, which takes a while for people to get their head around this one, because we're so used to aridity deserts. If you have a desert, it's because of a lack of water. No, during the Ice Age, deserts were caused by a lack of CO2. And so at high altitude, you would have these vast CO2 deserts forming. And the classic CO2 desert was the Gobi Plateau. The Gobi at present, you might think of it as a desert, but very little of it is actual desert. It's steppe grassland. It's covered with grazing animals all over it. During the Ice Age, as the world cooled and as CO2 fell in unison with the temperature, because the seas are absorbing the CO2, that's why the CO2 goes down. So the colder the seas are, the more CO2 they can absorb. So CO2 goes down with temperature. It reaches a point on the Gobi Plateau where all of the plants die, and you get a CO2 desert. And now this CO2 desert is exposed its virgin soils to the wind, and the wind can now take that material and dump it all over the lowest plateau, and dump it all over the Greenland ice sheets, and all over the Laurentide ice sheets, and all of the other ice sheets around the northern hemisphere. And that is why we get dust. And climate scientists are so obsessed with CO2 and temperature that they don't understand this whatsoever. Two instances. My paper was peer reviewed, of course. And the review came back. This was from the Royal Society. You've got to wonder about these people sometimes. The Royal Society in London. And the peer reviewer said, well, this paper is wrong completely, because there is the same percentage of CO2 at high altitude as there is at sea level. There's let's call it 200 parts per million at sea level. There is 200 parts per million CO2 on the top of Everest. It's the same percentage. Yeah, okay, fine, thanks very much, but there is less of it.
Right.
there is the same amount of oxygen at sea level as there is on the top of Mount Everest. Proportionately, the same percentage, call it 22%, whatever it is. There's 22% at sea level. There's 22% of the atmosphere on the top of Everest is oxygen. But you try climbing up the top of Everest and see what happens to you. The partial pressure actually lowers. There is less of it, and so you can't breathe, and you die on the top of Everest.
We had a famous
That's why
death
we have
fairly
oxygen
recently.
generators on aircraft. Oh, yeah, that's why we have oxygen generators on aircraft. You know, the proportion of oxygen in the atmosphere at 35,000 foot where you're flying in your commercial airliner, the proportion of oxygen in the atmosphere is exactly the same there as on the surface. But if you lose pressurization in the aircraft, you're going to die very quickly because there is less of it. And this was the argument that the reviewer was using in order to invalidate my paper, saying that CO2 percentages do not change with altitude. I mean, how dumb can you get, you know? And for that reason, my paper was actually thrown out by them. I had to go to another reviewer. I had to go to another body to get it passed. And I went to Geoscience Frontiers, and they passed it. And the other one, which is almost as bad, no, actually it's probably worse, was this wonderful paper I saw on paleoclimate. They have these paleoclimate maps, which are very nice, very detailed, of the whole Earth going back through the ages, showing what the temperature and the precipitation and various other aspects of the climate were all around the globe, going back thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. And they're very nice, very useful, not terribly accurate. Because this paper on South American tree lines, how do you determine the temperature? Well, there are various ways of studying fossils, minute marine fossils, which will tell you the temperature of the seas at sea level. And they've used that to determine the temperature of the Earth going back through hundreds of thousands of years. How do you determine what the aridity was, what the amount of precipitation was, the amount of water in the atmosphere? Well, they do that via tree lines. So the idea is, if you look at the tree lines back through thousands of years, you can see the tree line going up and down with temperature. And so if you know the temperature at the surface, and now if you calculate, because certain trees have a certain tree line at, you know, a certain altitude, a certain temperature at which they can live. And that determines where the tree line is up a mountain side. And so you can look for that particular type of tree, how far up the mountain it was, with fossilized trees, of course, with remains of fossilized trees. And so you can determine exactly what the temperature was on the top of that hill. And now you have temperature on the surface, temperature on the hill. You can work out the amount of moisture in the atmosphere via the lapse rate. The lapse rate is the reduction in temperature with altitude, which in the modern world, it's 1.5 degrees per 1,000 foot for a moist atmosphere, and it's 3 degrees per 1,000 foot for a dry atmosphere. So you can see the two different lapse rates depending on how moist the atmosphere is. But there's a problem with that. They had to come out with enormous lapse rates because the tree line was much, much lower than they thought. And therefore, it had to be really cold on the top of these hills. And therefore, the atmosphere must have been very dry. And so on the maps, they put all these areas as being very dry, not very humid at all, because the tree line was so low. What they hadn't calculated was the levels of CO2. And it turns out if you do the calculations on how much CO2 was in the atmosphere during the Ice Age, that the tree lines were being modulated by CO2 levels, not by temperature. When CO2 gets down to 190 parts per million at surface conditions, it is CO2 that becomes limiting in the tree lines going up a mountain side, not temperature. So they were calculating the wrong causal element because they didn't understand that CO2 kills trees. And, you know, trees need warmth, but they need CO2 as well. Otherwise, they can't
So the
live.
lack of CO2 kills trees.
Yeah, absolutely. And therefore, the lapse rate they calculated was totally incorrect because they were determining it on temperature. It wasn't on temperature. It was determined by CO2. And so the temperature could have been much warmer on those hillsides than they had calculated. And therefore, the lapse rate might have been a normal lapse rate that we get today, an average of 2 degrees per 1,000 foot. And therefore, all of their paleoclimate precipitation maps were actually wrong because they think it was much more arid than it actually probably was.
During the last ice age, how low did carbon dioxide get in the atmosphere?
About 190 parts per million.
And how was it before the industrial age in recent times, like during the Little Ice Age?
240.
So we're very close here.
Oh, yeah. It doesn't take much to go down. Doesn't take very much. I mean, we were in the pre-industrial age, we were hovering around the death point for most plant life. 50 parts per million at altitude, of course. You have to come down to about 150 parts per million at the surface to kill all of the plants on the surface. So you've got to come down 100 parts per million. But at altitude, you will start losing plants at altitude very quickly at 190 parts per million.
So it sounds like our automobiles are saving the planet.
Absolutely. The oil companies and the coal companies are the saviors of the planet, and they should be given a medal for saving the planet and saving the biosphere. The biosphere works well with lots of CO2. I mean, that's why the dinosaurs were so big. They complain about us having 400 parts per million of CO2 now. With the assistance of man, we've pumped it up to 400 parts per million. During the Cretaceous and the Jurassic era, we had 2,500 parts per million. And it was that excess CO2 that drove the size of the dinosaurs. You can't have large dinosaurs without large plants. You can't have large plants without lots of CO2. So that CO2 was generating the biosphere, the amount of plant life you need in order to generate large animals. And that's why we had a dinosaur era. And ever since then, of course, the amount of CO2 has dropped. And so dinosaurs wouldn't probably live very well in this sort of climate we have today. There's not enough CO2. And CO2 today is actually greening the planet. If you want to have a look at, there are many papers out there nowadays of the greening of the Earth in the modern era. That greening of the Earth is caused by extra CO2.
That's even in the Sahara, I understand.
Especially on the Sahara, because what CO2 does is it allows plants to live in arid conditions. Because what it does is the more CO2 you have, the less stomata you have on the plant, or the stomata can close up a little bit because they don't need to be open so much to get the CO2. Stomata are little mouths on the bottom of the plant leaves, which allow gases to go into the plant leaf. They're little valves, you might say, little openings on the bottom of the plant leaf. Well, when you have high CO2, you don't need so many of those, because you've got lots of CO2 in the atmosphere. This is one way that paleoclimatologists can actually determine the temperature in past eras. They can look at the number of stomata on a fossilized plant leaf, and that will tell you roughly how much CO2 there was in the atmosphere. So, and they correlate CO2 with temperature, of course. So if you have less stomata on your plant leaf, you don't lose as much water. So CO2 preferentially allows plants to live in more and more arid conditions. So the people who gain by having more CO2 are the people who live in arid conditions, up on the Gobi Plateau or on the edges of the Sahara. they benefit the most by having CO2 in the atmosphere.
That's not what Al Gore says.
That's not what Al Gore says, yeah. It's not what most climate scientists will say, because they will not give you the full truth. And if you are cherry picking the data you want to give, if you are cherry picking the truth you want to give, then that is no longer science. That is now political activism. In order for the general public, the intelligent general public, to understand what's going on, you need to give all of the facts, not just half of the facts. And leaving out the established truth that CO2 is good for plant life, that a lack of CO2 is disastrous for plant life, is leaving out not just a small part of the story, it's leaving out half of the global warming story. I mean, you might say, okay, CO2 is causing warming. I don't believe that at all, because my paper has disproved it. But you might say that. But tell us at the same time that CO2 is also promoting plant life. That's still half of the story, even if you believe that CO2 causes warming. I don't believe that CO2 causes warming at all, because of my paper, because within everything we've discussed in that science paper, there is no role for CO2 whatsoever. You don't need it.
Though, in a sense, it's a reverse role.
It's a reverse role, yeah, because lack of CO2 kills all the plant life. Yeah. But it's not actually causing warming at all, because it's only a trace gas in the atmosphere.
Right. There's been a lot of studies on this, hasn't there? I mean, because there are other gases that serve, like water vapor. They just sort of obscure or occlude the effect of CO2 anyway. Is that not correct?
Of CO2, yes. So it becomes a minor player in this argument. The biggest greenhouse gas, because, the greenhouse effect is a real effect, but the biggest greenhouse gas is water vapor, H2O.
Yeah,
now that's 95% of the greenhouse effect is caused by water vapor, not by CO2. So you can see that CO2 is quite a minor player in this little game of controlling the climate. And they don't even take into account, there was a wonderful paper, I thought, by Willis Eschenbach, who wrote the thunderstorm thermostat theory. And I wish he had made it into a proper paper, because it's not peer-reviewed at present. I wish he'd made it as a peer-reviewed paper. I mean, he's a mathematician, but he decided to make this theory that the warmer the climate you have, the earlier the thunderstorms start to pop in the tropical regions. And because they pop earlier, you get these bright white clouds in the atmosphere much earlier. And the sun is reflected, again, it's all caused by albedo. The sun is reflected from the top of these white clouds all over the tropical region. And because the tropics is so important, because that's where most of the sun is in the tropics, with the sun directly overhead, you're again radiating away a lot of energy. And so you end up with a thermostat system.
A kind of homeostasis.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. The warmer the seas are, the more thunderstorms you get, and the earlier the thunderstorms are during the day, and therefore the more heat is rejected. So the seas cool. And the cooler the seas are, the less thunderstorms you get, and therefore you get more insolation, more sun, more warming. And so you get this thermostat, which controls the temperature within certain limits within the tropics. Very valid argument, but it's not in any of the climate models. It just shows you how much they're missing within the climate models. Climate models don't include solar effects. They don't include albedo. They don't include the thunderstorm thermostat theory. They don't include cosmic rays, which also might promote albedo. They don't include oceanic cycles. And there are two major oceanic cycles which may explain all of, or a lot of, the recent warming we've had. They are the Pacific decadal oscillation and the Atlantic decadal oscillation. And and they run on like a 60-year cycle. And we've been on the warming side of that cycle for 30 years.
Is China's pollution, and they're going through a rapid industrialization in the last 25 years or so, has that contributed any dust, so to speak, on the ice caps?
It could well be. This is what the Dark Snows project was out there trying to look at on the ice sheets up in the Arctic. But of course, they weren't investigating CO2. So they got no money at all. So they had to fund their expedition and their science using a GoFundMe, because nobody would give them the funds to go and investigate dust on ice sheets. This is the trouble with having this all-pervasive theory of CO2 where nobody else can get any funding. And so they were looking for this very effect, the fact that recent warming might have been exacerbated, A, by oceanic cycles, and B, by Chinese dust. Because they've been pumping out dust, it's all been falling on the Arctic ice sheets, and it could be that that's causing the melting and the smaller ice sheets in the north, and not ambient temperatures and CO2.
Yeah.
Could well be, but no one's investigated, so how would we know?
Well, maybe if we weren't spending trillions of dollars of tax money around the world investigating things that aren't happening, we could...
Yes. Yes. Well, I don't like this CO2 argument because they won't even investigate the very basis of the CO2 theory. And there are very, very few papers out there on this because they can't find the effect. The fundamental aspect of CO2 global warming is that CO2 is absorbing the long-wave radiation going out from the Earth. It's re-radiating some of that up, some of that down, and that re-radiated energy coming down is therefore warming the Earth. That is the greenhouse effect. That's how it works. And it does work. But if you have an increasing greenhouse effect, then that amount of downwelling long-wave radiation should be increasing. And you can discover that in two fashions. You can detect it on the Earth with detectors, and that should detect the increase in DLR, as they call it. Or you can actually do radio sondes into the atmosphere, and you can detect the temperature of the atmosphere at tropospheric levels. We're talking, 20 to 40,000 foot, fairly low in the atmosphere. That part of the atmosphere should be warming because that's where the greenhouse effect comes from. That is the greenhouse glass, as it were, in the atmosphere that is reflecting this, or it's not reflecting, it's re-radiating this energy back down to the Earth. And you can measure that as a temperature increase or even a height increase of that temperature within the atmosphere. But it's never been detected. So we've actually not for that long, unfortunately. They could have done this many, many decades ago, but they've been measuring the amount of downwelling long-wave radiation from the atmosphere, and it's not increasing. But that's a problem, because if it's not increasing, there is no increase in the greenhouse effect over the last 20 years that they've been monitoring it. Well, that's a real problem, because that takes away the very foundations of the CO2 greenhouse warming effect. Unless you can show an increase in DLR or an increase in the temperature in the troposphere, in the tropics mainly, there is no increase in the greenhouse effect. And I've asked this question on many, many occasions to people who ought to know the subject, to climate scientists, and nobody has been able to show me an increase in these two aspects, the DLR and the tropical temperatures. And if there is not an increase, there is no increase in global warming.
And surely in the popular discussions of the science, we don't hear ideas like diminishing returns. I mean, that's, in economics, you talk about,
Yes.
I mean, this is a basic concept in science. I mean, are you getting an increasing or decreasing rate from some group of inputs?
Yes.
And the idea that, oh, sure, CO2 has an effect that's greenhouse, but when you increase it, if you increase the amount of CO2, are you getting an increasing effect, or is there a diminishing returns to the increase in the effect?
Yeah.
That you almost never hear that talked about.
And that's why we have this term of a doubling of CO2, because the effect of CO2 on warming in the atmosphere is inversely logarithmic. So it actually tapers off with increasing CO2. So you have to double the amount of CO2 each time in order to get the same warming effect. And of course, we're already at a high point in the CO2 where it's not actually giving very much extra warming.
So they do recognize it to some extent. I mean, that is scientists rather than the popularizers.
Yes. So our jump from, say, 250, 240 parts per million to call it nearly 500 parts per million. Well, to have that same effect again, you would have to go from 500 parts per million to 1,000 parts per million. So we're talking about a huge increase in CO2. And there's probably not enough fossil fuels in the earth for us to actually do that. So we've already had the maximum amount of, even if you believe that CO2 is having an effect on the atmosphere, we've had the maximum amount of warming already that it can almost possibly give. As you say, you get diminishing returns after this point. But I don't see any effect whatsoever over the last 20 years from any increase in CO2. It's just not there. And unless someone can show you and show myself that increase in DLR or atmospheric warming, then CO2 is not the culprit. We have had some warming, but what about all of the other possibilities that can affect that warming? There was a great cartoon, I think it was in What's Up With That, which is a sort of climate skeptic website you probably know. And it had this big old-fashioned, mechanical computer. And it had all of the scientists fussing around the CO2 knob, but totally ignoring the other knobs, which said, oceanic cycles, water vapor, solar cycles, all of this sort of stuff. All of these other switches were being totally ignored on this grand old mechanical computer. And all they were fussing about was the CO2 knob, which was the smallest knob on the whole machine.
Right. I've seen that cartoon.
And
it is pretty funny.
Yeah, it was a good cartoon. You should show it. And the biggest knob, of course, was the water vapor knob,
right? Because
that has the greatest effect, of course. So again, we see this problem with cherry picking the data and cherry picking the science. If you're only giving half the data, or even less than that, actually, if you're not giving the full spectrum of all of the data and theories that go into climate science, you're not giving climate science. You're giving climate political activism. And that's what it's become. They will not tell you anything that detracts from the CO2 argument. And in fact, if you want to go outside the establishment and mention something that's not CO2, you will get defunded.
Yeah.
It's this whole cancellation culture business. If you go outside the establishment, we will cancel you. Just as they did Professor Peter Ridd. I don't know if you've read the stories about Peter Ridd.
I don't remember.
He was
him. No, the name doesn't seem
Yeah,
familiar.
he was Australia. He belonged to the JCU, the university in Queensland, Australia, researching the barrier reef. And so he did a review of papers from the JCU. What's JCU? James Cook University, I think. And he determined that many of the papers were inadequate. They were giving incorrect data, and some of them were deliberately falsifying the data. And they were inadequately peer reviewed. So the peer review system was totally broken within the university. And so he invalidated more than half of the papers coming out of the JCU and said that actually the Great Barrier Reef was not under threat. And he showed that this had happened in the past. It wasn't just, modern temperatures that had caused any of these effects. And the reef had always recovered from these, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he said that their science was inadequate and often completely wrong. And so he was dismissed. Rather than taking on board those criticisms that, a lot of the peer review process in Queensland was defective, they just dismissed him to get rid of the problem. Now, normally that would be the end of the problem, because what can you do? You're up against this big bureaucratic establishment and you're just little you. There's not much you can do. But of course, nowadays, you can go to a GoFundMe, and he got $700,000 in order to fight them. So they took him to court. They weren't satisfied because he had made a bit of a fuss. They weren't satisfied with just dismissing him. So they took him to court on 17 counts of malpractice. And he won the court case on all 17 counts. And so they went to appeal. I mean, they're wasting thousands, millions of dollars now on these court processes. And they took him to a court of appeal, and the university won the appeal. And so now he's gone back to the GoFundMe, and he's got another $900,000 to fight them back again, to say, look, you've got to have some freedom of thought and freedom of speech within the university environment. Otherwise, you don't have a university. You might not agree with what I've said, but if you don't agree with it, just tell me why I'm wrong. Don't throw me out the door and try and rubbish me and saying, because they always dig into your past and find past misdemeanors as a way of denigrating you, which they love doing. So now it's going to go to the Supreme Court in Australia, and that's scheduled for, I think, February or something. So that's going to come up shortly in the future. But that is what you get if you go against the establishment, which is why this is not science. This is political activism. We had the same in the UK. I mean, this has happened on numerous occasions. Judith Curry in America had the same problem. She was forced out of her place. Tim Ball was taken to court because he disagreed with Michael Mann. And yeah, he threatened legal action. And so Tim Ball, another professor, of course, said, right on, okay, I'll take you on. And that's a problem, because what he had been complaining about is that Michael Mann, who's one of these founders of the global warming movement, you probably know about him, never gives his data or his methodology. He won't give his computer programs out.
And he's been caught in some shady email scandals too. I mean, this is not a pristine gentleman.
Not at all. But what happens in the American court system, I don't know if it happens all over the world, I've not been involved in this very much, is if you say, okay, I'll take you on, you have to have disclosure. And disclosure means that Michael Mann would have to give his data and his methodologies, and he's refused to do so. So this court process is dragged on for 10 years or something, and it's never got to court because he refuses to give the information out. And we had the same in the UK with our favorite ecologist, David Bellamy, who was the darling of the whole nation. If there was any ecological film out, he worked for the BBC basically. So if there was any climate or ecological program out, it was always him that was on it. And then he mentioned that he didn't believe in global warming and he didn't like wind turbines, and he disappeared.
Yeah, it was quite
and
swift.
Everyone was asking, where's he gone to? Have they sent him off to the gulags or something? Where's this guy gone to? And as soon as he said that he didn't agree with this, boom, he was out. And unfortunately, if you do that sort of thing, we are no longer talking about science. Science breeds itself on having radical ideas come into it. And if your theory is sound, you'll be able to knock those ideas down, or you incorporate them if they're good ideas. And that's how we advance in science and actually find out, the empirical truth. But if all you're going to do is swat people down every time they disagree with your theory and try and dismiss them and try and actually destroy their life, then you no longer have science. Because people like Peter Ridd, Judith Curry, Tim Ball don't care, because they are coming up to retirement, beyond retirement. So it's not a great problem to them. But you think of yourself as a young scientist coming up within the university system. How on earth are you going to emulate the Balls, the Currys, and the Ridds in making opposition to what you are being taught and what you have to teach to your students if you know that you're going to be destroyed? As a young scientist, you just can't afford to do that. You can't risk your house, your life, your marriage, your whatever else you'll lose if you get dismissed, because you'll never get another job again. What other university is going to take you on? Why were you dismissed from JCU? Well, I disagreed with them. Sorry, you're not going to join us.
Yeah,
it's a very, very slippery road to tyranny if you're going to destroy people who disagree with a particular theory. If he's wrong or she's wrong, prove them wrong. Say you're mistaken, This is why you're wrong. Sorry, come back with a better idea.
This is why what we're describing here doesn't seem even as political as religious or cultic. I mean, really, this is heresy we're talking about, and they're prosecuting it with social controls, with huge attacks, and this is quite chilling. It seems, I don't want to sound hysterical, but I'm going to sound hysterical. It sounds like the death of Western civilization. It really sounds bad to me.
It does, yeah. This is not how Western civilization was based and founded. It was founded on free expression. I go into this in some of my religious type books as well, because it pertains to the Reformation and the Age of Enlightenment. It was only when people could have freedom of expression away from the Catholic Church that we got the scientific revolution. So the Industrial Revolution in Britain was soundly based upon the Enlightenment. It would not have occurred without the Enlightenment. And it followed on one from the other. As soon as we had the Enlightenment, then the Royal Society was founded. And it could not have been founded in previous decades and centuries. And then, from the Royal Society, which is our, supposed to be our premier scientific establishment, except that they know nothing about CO2 and plant life, apart from that, then we got the Industrial Revolution, and the one followed from the other. And unless you have that open discussion, you cannot have any advances in science. We're sort of hoping that the rest of science has not been infected with this terrible authoritarianism. But who knows? The rest of science may be just as bad as climate science. It certainly seems to be creeping throughout the whole of the sciences.
It seems like we're going to have a reverse of the old system. We're going to have an in-group and out-group. The in-group may have science, the people who actually do science, but it'll be kept from what we can talk about. And it won't be public science, it'll be private science, which actually might get us to the subject of your many books, because there seem to be traditions of private science or of insular science in ancient times. And you deal with some of that in your books about Egypt and the rise of Judaism and Christianity.
Insular religion or insular science?
The knowledge of the precession of the earth, for instance, is important for these
yes.
people. You've made it pretty clear, actually, in your books that this was a huge issue for the shepherd kings of Egypt and so forth. I must say that your books are quite astounding. They're some of the most interesting things I've read this last year. I've been blown away.
I see one of them behind you.
That's the only one that I have in physical form, and it's the only one I haven't read that I have.
Again, it's an interesting way of looking at history in the same way as I've looked at science. There was an equal problem that we had within history and theology, in that there were great lacunas, there were great gaps in our understanding of what happened in these eras. So, we have these stories, we have these books that have come out of history, and nothing within those books can be found within the historical record, which is odd. And so we get the division of historians and theologians into the literalists, who believe it just because it says so in that particular book, the Bible. And we have the minimalists or the mythicists who say, well, sorry, can't find any of this in the historical record, therefore it must be fiction. It must be mythological. And there is no middle ground between the two of them.
My favorite example is one that's bugged me for a long time, is the problem of the Hyksos.
Yes.
Because I've been reading about 18th dynasty pharaohs for a long time, all my adult life. Fascinated by Akhenaten and, the Thutmoses and all, just the whole crowd. And I've read a lot. But one of the things that you come up against, I think nearly every person who studied this has thought the thought and then immediately dismissed it, is that were the Jews the Hyksos? I mean, it has to have crept into your mind at some point. I know it did mine, and I know I immediately disposed of it. But until recently, when I was challenged on it, and I repeated the same old truth, they've never found any evidence for the Exodus in any of the documents of ancient Egypt. And I repeated all that, and then I realized, I wonder if that's true. And that's when I discovered your book, Tempest and Exodus.
Yeah, because I wondered that same thing. And nowadays, I wonder how people cannot see what you and I have both seen, because it's so obvious that there is a link between the Israelites and the Hyksos. For people who are not familiar with this era, this is about, call it 1600 BC. And we have this civil war between the north and the south in Egypt. And we have these northerners who were called the Hyksos, the shepherd kings of Egypt. And we have the southerners who were, as it were, the normal pharaohs of Egypt. And there was this civil war between them. And eventually the Hyksos peoples got thrown out of Egypt on an exodus. So you can see the obvious possible parallels that we're running into here. But it just so happens that this Hyksos exodus, if you delve into it, which most people don't, as you say, most people sort of cast it aside, and I'm not sure why they cast it aside. I think it's because it's too disturbing to their belief systems, and so they have to cast it to one side because it intrudes too much on their feelings. But the Exodus is exactly the same as the biblical Exodus. Exactly. So,
and the Egyptians have records of it. They talk about it.
Oh yeah. They talk about it. We have the information. So this is from real Egyptian history. So I'm not talking about the Bible now. We have this event, and it's called the Hyksos Exodus. So we have this group of leaders, this group of kings, who were called shepherds, and they wore earrings and curly side locks of hair, the same as the Jews do today. One of their kings was called Jacob or Jacob. They were involved in a war with the southern Egyptians, so there is this battle between the two. There was storms and darkness for 3 days, so there was, a
plague,
the plagues of Egypt, basically. There was an ash fall. You remember Moses saying, what did Moses say? God said unto Moses, take you handfuls of ash from the hearth of the fire and cast it up into the air, and it will fall over Egypt as a small light dust over the entire land of Egypt. That's the biblical quote, and it's exactly the same as we get for the Hyksos Exodus.
Though they don't ascribe it to Moses. They just talk about the fall, right?
Yeah, the Hyksos don't ascribe it to Moses, no. But the biblical version does. But we get an ash fall in both events. So there was this ash fall. There were 500,000 of these Hyksos peoples who were ejected from Pyramisi and went to Jerusalem. And they, en route to Jerusalem, they destroyed Jericho. Okay, so, and also there was a parting of the waters as they went there. There was a parting of the waters, and it's probably likely that someone got engulfed by the waters when they came back again. And there was a pillar of fire and a pillar of smoke. Okay, this is all from real history. This is not from the Bible. Does that sound similar? It sounds almost exactly the same to me as the biblical account of the Exodus. The only difference between the two is this happened in 1570 BC, and the Exodus itself happened in about, call it 1300, 1280 BC. That is the only difference between the two. So why can't you say that these are the same? Why can you not equate them? Well, because if you equate them, you are saying that the Israelites are the Hyksos. This is why people won't address this problem, because you're immediately saying that the Israelites were Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt, which changes the story somewhat. You know, suddenly these people were not slaves of the Egyptians. They were the Hyksos, who were the most powerful people in the world at that time, who had the greatest military. They had chariots and so on. No one else had chariots. They had composite bows and all of this sort of business, which nobody else had. They were a powerful people. And so it changes the story. But if you look into the works of Josephus Flavius, who's the greatest Jewish historian from the first century, and he says, because he writes about this history, and he says that the Hyksos were our people. So Josephus Flavius is specifically saying that the Hyksos Exodus was the Israelite Exodus. And everyone just totally ignores him. I put this into Wiki. So, and I know Wiki is very difficult sometimes. They won't take anything that's not published. So you can't put an idea in there. So I just put in a quote from Josephus saying that Josephus says that the Hyksos were our people. And I put one quote there. It was just one line long. And it was deleted. So I put it back in again, and it was deleted. I put it back in again. This happened on about 8 occasions. And we had this huge, great argument, because on Wiki, they have the talk pages. You can go into the talk pages and have a look. And this argument went on for 3 months and about 36 pages of argument that they would not allow this quote from Josephus. And the argument in the end turned out to be, you cannot quote from Josephus because he's an unreliable source, and therefore we're not going to allow this into Wiki. But of course, if you look through Wiki pages, you know, anything to do with the first century in, you know, the Near East has a quote from Josephus, because he's the only source you can use.
And they quote Herodotus.
And so if you look through Wiki...
I mean, it's not as if he's the most reliable historian on the planet.
He is. There's probably 1 million quotes from Wiki from Josephus Flavius. But they wouldn't allow it, and it's still not there. They won't allow this information to be there. And that's why you cannot discover this today, because if you look through any academic books, if you look through Wiki, if you look even in popular culture, it's very, very difficult to find anyone who compares the Hyksos with the Israelites. I think I was one of the first, and I'm probably still one of the few who actually do that. And throughout my books, I call them the Hyksos Israelites.
Yes.
To reinforce the fact that they are the same.
It's very strange, this ability. I mean, because this is introspection on my part. I mean, I kick myself because I've thought of it. I mean, it's not as if it didn't cross my mind, as I said before. It's an obvious thing to ask. It's like if you don't ask it, you're kind of dumb.
Yes.
Right? So how do we have a whole civilization full of academics working on these issues and they never ask the question, much less answer it, even in the negative? I mean, they just don't deal with it. I have a book on the Hyksos. I bought it recently. It's a classic. And I don't believe Israelites are really come up at all.
No, not mentioned. Even though their leaders have the same names.
They don't mention that.
Israelites. No, they certainly don't mention that. I mean, Jacob, for instance, one of their pharaohs, two of their pharaohs were called Jacobah or Jacobam. And of course, the biblical Jacob was called Jacob. It's the same name. You have Mamabra, which is Abram-Mam, depending on how you read the glyphs. Most of these Israelite patriarchs can be found as names of the Hyksos people. And I go through this and I show the similarity between the names, that they are probably Israelites, what we would call Israelites. And of course, the Israelites were known as shepherds.
But here they're shepherd kings.
They like to say that's, yeah.
A little bit different. There is a difference between a Levantine shepherd and a shepherd king of the Nile Delta.
Yeah. It's the same title. They like to say that this is an agricultural profession, but of course the shepherd kings were the shepherd kings because we're looking at precession again. We're looking at the Zodiac once more. Taurus had changed into Aries in 1750 BC, and that's when we got the rise of the shepherd kings, the Hyksos. So quite clearly this was linked to the precession of the equinox and people studying the stars. And that's why they called themselves shepherds. Nothing to do with pastoral activities. And they destroyed Jericho. So they say, oh, there's no evidence for the Exodus because there's no evidence that Jericho was destroyed by the Israelites, because Jericho had been deserted for 200 or 300 years before the Israelites went on their Exodus. Yeah, but only if you think that the Exodus happened in 1280 BC and Ramesses, time of Ramesses II or whatever. If you sort of put that to one side for a minute and believe that the Israelites were the Hyksos, then the evidence at Jericho says that the people who destroyed Jericho were the Hyksos shepherds of Egypt, the Israelites. And so it does match, because it was the Hyksos who destroyed Jericho, exactly as it says within the biblical text. And suddenly the biblical text then becomes more history than it does mythology. It's actually giving you a true history if you understand what it's trying to tell you. And the other one I like from the same sort of arguments we've been talking about here was the conversation between Joseph and Pharaoh. So Joseph, this is the guy with the coat of many colors. He comes down into Egypt and he grows up to be Prime Minister of Egypt. And then he invites his family down into Egypt and he talks to his brothers and says, look, you're going to meet Pharaoh. Do not say to Pharaoh that you are shepherds. Say to him you have been cattle breeders from your youth until now. Otherwise you will not be allowed to stay in the lands of Egypt. And you think, well, hold on a minute. That doesn't make any sense. There was no prohibition against raising sheep or eating lamb, within Egypt. So what on earth is this on about? This is the trouble with the Bible. Unless you know what it's talking about, it makes no sense. But if you suddenly realize that they're talking about Hyksos shepherd kings and they're talking about the precession of the equinox, suddenly it becomes wholly understandable. And so what Joseph was saying to his brothers is, when you meet Pharaoh, don't say you are Hyksos Israelite shepherd kings, because otherwise you'll get thrown out of the country. Say instead that you are Apis bull worshippers, and then you'll be allowed to stay. Why? Because just prior to that, the Hyksos had been thrown out of Egypt in this enormous great civil war. So, of course, the Pharaoh wouldn't allow you to stay in Egypt if he thought you were shepherd kings, the Hyksos. You would get thrown out of Egypt. And this is talking about the precession of the equinox, because Taurus had changed to Aries in 1750 BC. And so there was a change, there was a division within the religion of Egypt between the bull worshippers, who have been worshipping the bull for 2,800 years prior to this, and the new people who venerated Aries and the shepherd kings.
I want to ask you kind of a basic or a step-back question here for a moment. What do you think normal people in Egypt thought of bulls versus rams? What do they think about the sacrifices they made, or what is going to them? What are they doing?
I don't think it would affect the average person so much, because like Judaism, religion was performed within the temple. And so the average person on the street didn't go to the temple. It was a professional organization for the priesthood, and the general public were largely excluded from that. But within the priesthood, it was a very important aspect of their religion. So they had their normal gods, but they were venerating a particular symbol, which was the prime symbol of their religion, which happened to be the Apis bull. And we have this enormous great, the great burial chamber, I forget what it's called now for a minute, in Egypt, where they buried all of the bulls. This was a prime...
is that the Osirian?
I can't remember what... Yes. No, not the Osirian. No. There's another one. And there's these vast sarcophagus to take bulls. And it's up by Giza somewhere. Anyway, I'll remember it in a minute. And so that was a very large part of their religious belief system. And suddenly this gets changed into a veneration of sheep instead, because now Aries is the prominent constellation in the night sky. And half of Egypt obviously turned towards the veneration of sheep, and the other half down in the south of Egypt didn't. And so they carried on worshipping or venerating the Apis bull. And the Torah sort of mirrors that, in that this is exactly what Abraham was doing. So Abraham goes down into Egypt to spy on the Egyptians and see what they were actually venerating within their religion. He was spying on the Egyptians, exactly as the Hyksos would have been doing to the southern Egyptians when this civil war started between north and south. And the nice thing is that we can date these events very, very accurately, because there is a nice chronological peg that we can hang all of this onto, which is the eruption of Santorini in the Mediterranean. So Santorini was the biggest eruption within recorded history. Out in the Mediterranean, it's just beyond the island of Crete, and the whole island exploded. And it was this that caused the plagues of Egypt. But the plagues of Egypt are not only recorded in the Bible, they're recorded in Egyptian history on the Tempest Stela. Hence my book was called Tempest and Exodus, which happened at the time of Ahmose I, or Karmosi, which was the pharaoh before Ahmose. So we're talking about 1620 BC here, the time of the Exodus, the Hyksos Exodus, just about. And so we had this enormous great explosion out in the Mediterranean. And we know that it caused a darkness for 3 days in Egypt, a great ash fall, the same ash fall that is described by Moses, throwing ash up into the sky so it falls as small dust across the land of Egypt. It caused a pillar of smoke, a pillar of fire, and it caused a huge, great tsunami, the parting of the waters which destroyed the Egyptian army. And I described these as 5 black swan events. You know, a black swan event is something so unusual, so unpredictable, that no one could have invented it. And that sort of suggests that this event is true, because no one could have invented something so bizarre. But here we have 5 black swans all together. And they are all caused by the same event, by an eruption out in the Mediterranean. We have the ashfall, we have the tsunami, we have the pillar of smoke and fire, we have the darkness for 3 days, all caused by one single event. And so we can be pretty sure that this is an eyewitness eyewitness account of this single event. Otherwise, all of these items would not be mentioned together within the plagues. Someone must have been sitting there watching these events affect Egypt and then recording them, including that very strange idea that the sea should run away and part, and that an army could go out onto the beach wondering what on earth is going on, picking up the fish that are, oh, look, here's breakfast, picking up the fish. And then the sea rushes back in again and consumes the Egyptian army. You could not invent that yourself without having seen it. Even in the modern era, people didn't know really what a tsunami was until they saw the Asian tsunami and the devastating effect it can have. Which is great because it confirms that the biblical story is correct, that it's
sort of.
Sort of correct. It's historical. It's been changed slightly, as it would. It's been bent to suit the people who wrote it. Of course, they wrote it in their favor. Half of their army could have been destroyed as well, but they're not going to tell you that. It's just the Egyptians got caught by it. We didn't get caught by it.
And when you say Egyptians, what we're really talking about is the southern Egyptians of Upper Egypt.
Southern Egyptians.
And so when the Israelites are talking about the Egyptians, they're Egyptians too at this point.
But they didn't call themselves Egyptians. This is the slight dichotomy in the terminology that they use. Even coming up to the 1st century AD with Josephus, when he talks about Egyptians, he's talking about Thebes.
Very good.
He's not talking about northern Egypt as we would. So he didn't see it as a unified nation. Egyptians to him were in the south, down at Thebes. And this is what the Bible says the same sort of thing. And so when it's talking about Egyptians, it's talking about the Theban Egyptians down in the south.
Right.
And so there was this civil war between the Hyksos and the southern Egyptians.
And I also want to get in here to remind my listeners and viewers that they probably, like me, were told all their lives that there is no historical record by Egyptians of the Exodus. And they were told this over and over again, and then they probably with a snide tone in the voice, those stupid religious people, those stupid Jews, those stupid Christians, they believe all these dumb things. They're deplorables and rubes, which is kind of grating when you think about it, how that's usually done. But it's been done by lots and lots of people, the debunker type of folks.
Yes, and
it's been there all along in Josephus and in Manetho.
Yes.
This has been in the book. I recently bought Loeb editions of these things. Just because
yes, I see them there. Yes.
Yeah, and just because I wanted to actually look at them and have them in my hand as I read it rather than do it on the screen like I do so many books. And it's kind of shocking. And this is one of the reasons I actually really wanted you on, because I do want to sort of get your opinion on just how shockingly out of touch with reality academic and proud, with it people in the academy who are historians, scientists, how they can repeat things that simply aren't true. And the evidence against them is right in front of them if they manage to pick up the book.
And they've probably read it themselves.
Right. It's an astounding thing.
But they've discarded it.
It's an astounding thing. I mean, this is...
Yeah. They put blinds on their eyes and they don't see it.
So I think that as we're going through a weird time now in world history with the COVID-19 business and all the lockdowns and mask mandates and all that, we should remind people that it's possible for the experts to be completely wrong.
And deliberately wrong.
Yeah, that's an interesting problem, isn't it?
Because that is the real problem. Because same as these climate scientists who know what I know about, downwelling long wave radiation and so on, they know that exactly the same as I know that, but they won't mention it to you. And then the historians and the theologians, they know about the Hyksos Exodus exactly the same as I know about it, but they're not going to tell you. And yeah, with COVID-19, there's lots of stuff I'm sure they are telling us, and they know the gaps in the science that they are not telling you. And this happens time and time again. And you think, well, hold on a minute. Why are people doing this? Are they just deceitful? Is that in their nature that they're 100% deceitful? Do they have an agenda that they're trying to pass across to you? I think that's half the problem. The theologians, of course, have an agenda with this. They don't want to admit that the Israelites were the Hyksos because that overturns a lot of their story. Suddenly the Israelites are not poor slaves in Egypt. They're actually powerful people in Egypt who are battling against the southern Egyptians. That changes the story somewhat. This story of oppression, we've got to stick together because these evil Egyptians are oppressing us. We were just the slaves of these mighty Egyptians. No, that story is not right at all. You were actually potentially more powerful than the southern Egyptians, but you still got your ass whipped and you got thrown out of Egypt. That's a more difficult history to sell to the public. And with the climate scientists, they know all of the things we've been discussing, but they're not going to tell you that because that overturns all of the I don't know what you'd call it, the strategy that they're trying to give to you. You cannot sell global warming and the destruction of fossil fuels if fossil fuels are not the thing that's actually causing the global warming. It would end all of those arguments, There would be no reason to get rid of fossil fuels if you understand the truth of this. In fact, you could make a very good argument that we should get as much coal and as much oil into the atmosphere as possible because CO2 is good. Lack of CO2 is bad. They're not going to make that argument because it goes against everything that they are trying to tell us. And so they, by every means, they have to cover up that part of the argument. Yeah. And exactly the same could be happening with COVID-19. Whatever their base intention is, they could well be covering up a lot of what's happening. And I think they are.
But you have given an additional aspect to explain all this. A different factor is involved. You mentioned in one of your talks. Okay, now I'm having trouble remembering what your theory was. Basically, the bandwagon effect.
Oh yes. Yes, I do like bandwagons rather than conspiracies, because a conspiracy rather means that you are forced into something, either economically or with, threats of violence or threats of dismissal or whatever, that you are forced into believing something. But with a bandwagon, you don't need any force. And you can think of many bandwagons. The religious one is obvious, If you are a part of this religious establishment, if this is what you want to believe, of course you're going to go onto this bandwagon and stay with it because, well, if you start saying that Israelites are the Hyksos, you might fall off your bandwagon. Suddenly everything has been changed. Same with climate science. If you are with this bandwagon, and this is why climate science works so well, you are the virtuous. Everybody else is heretics. They want to destroy the earth. I'm saving the earth, I'm the virtuous one. You are evil. This is my bandwagon that I've climbed upon of my own volition. You don't have to pay me to do it. I'm climbing on this bandwagon because that makes me virtuous. And you're going to do everything you can in your power to stay on that bandwagon. You don't want to be thrown off that bandwagon. You don't want your bandwagon to hit a buffer and come to an abrupt halt. So you're going to go along with what they say. And I think that the same is true of the COVID-19 as well. There are many people who have jumped on this bandwagon. I am the virtuous because I'm wearing a mask.
Right.
You are evil because you are not wearing a mask. Doesn't matter what the science says, That's irrelevant. I'm now virtue signaling that I'm above you. This is part of the problem, yes.
Yeah. I've been haranguing my friends on social media about this for quite some time, making and I'm sure I've endeared myself. Most of my, I would say half of my friends probably block me by now.
Yeah. And this is what happens because you're the heretic. You're evil, you see. They're virtuous. But what they won't know, and I've come across this all of the time, all of the people who oppose you don't know the facts. They don't know the data. They're going on emotion. They don't know anything about the subject. But you're still evil because you disagree with them, even though they don't understand the subject, whether it's the history, whether it's the climate, whether it's COVID-19. I mean, the best one for here, and I think it pertains to America as well, is the demographics of COVID-19 they will never give in the media. So the demographics of COVID-19 in the UK is that of people under 55 years old, only 670 people have died since February, which is a drop in the ocean. And more than half of those people under 55 had other health problems. So you're talking about, maybe 250, 300 people since February have died of COVID-19, which is absolutely nothing. You get more people dying on the roads than dying of COVID in those terms. And we don't close the roads down and say, oh, we've got to close down all the road system because it's dangerous. We balance risk. That's what politicians must do. They must balance risk. So there was no point ever shutting down the whole nation when, the vast majority of the working population could carry on working without any problems. But they won't tell you that.
Right. Your country's Neil Ferguson recently admitted that...
yes.
He's quite a piece of work, by the way.
He is. We call him Professor Pants Down.
Okay, very good.
Because he went off and broke all of the COVID rules to go and see his lover somewhere.
Right. But he's recently admitted that the whole lockdown scenario, they didn't even conceive of it really until they saw it happen in China and then in Italy. And they just, then everybody can do it.
Yeah.
So I guess in a sense that's a bandwagon effect too, is that they took a lead, and this is
jumping on the same old bandwagon.
But it is one of the most amazing religious manias I've ever witnessed, and I do consider sort of a religious mania. But I do want to get back to this idea. When I talk to people about the cultic nature of how people deal with ideas, people usually think of cults as something that's on the margins of society. They're the bad people. They're the deplorables. But they don't think of it as the religion itself. That is the mainstream. That is the power centers, the popes and the catechists. But they also behave in a rather similar way to the people on the margins if they have an occasion to do so, it seems like.
Yeah. a lot of these religions are not as they seem on the surface. And one of the classic examples I give of that is the way Judaism has evolved. You know, we have this view of Judaism as we see it today, with people in dark coats and big hats and curly side locks of hair. And we tend to think that that is Judaism, but that wasn't Judaism historically. Judaism historically was polytheist. And they will say, no, it wasn't. You know, we were fighting against polytheism, but we were never polytheists. But, you know, Kings David and Solomon erected temples to all of the gods, to Molech, and I think he erected temples to 3 gods. And then the wife of Asa, so she was Queen Makkah, again from the Tanakh, she was worshipping an idol, as it says in the text. But of course, that's the English translation, and you have to go back into what the Aramaic was. And I forget what the Aramaic was. It was quite funny because they made it rhyme with what it actually meant. And that didn't make much sense to me because I don't speak Aramaic very well. So I went back into the Latin with the Vulgate. And that said that she was worshipping a Priapus. Now that I understood, and I don't know if your listeners do, but a Priapus was a Roman sort of godlet with an enormous great penis. So she was worshipping a phallic symbol. And probably this was no more than an Egyptian obelisk, which are phallic symbols. And so she was venerating this obelisk. And this sort of polytheism went down the ages. So you see, Mary Magdalene was probably doing the same. Her name means Mary of the Tower. What sort of tower was that? It was probably, again, an obelisk, because she was venerating it, because she was an incarnation of Isis. And the Israelites thrown out of Jerusalem during the Babylonian exile were doing very much the same. So we have this Babylonian exile where, you know, Jerusalem was destroyed and many of the people were taken back to Babylon as slaves. But a load of them escaped and went down into Egypt. And they went under the mad priest Jeremiah. So this is in the book of Jeremiah within the Tanakh. And all the way down on this trip, he is fulminating against them because they are worshipping the Queen of Heaven. So these are Jews coming out of Jerusalem, and they were worshipping the Queen of Heaven. And they said, we're not going to stop venerating the Queen of Heaven, because when we venerated her, things were good. When we stopped, when you started going on at us, then we got attacked by the Babylonians and we got thrown out. So we're going to continue venerating the Queen of Heaven. And of course, who's the Queen of Heaven? She's Isis, the archetypal female goddess of the whole of the East. She is Isis. In Egyptian, she's called Ast, not Isis. So she is Ast. She is Astarte. She is Astoreth. All of these names, Esther, come from Isis, the Queen Isis, as does Venus and Aphrodite, of course, as well. They were all venerating this archetypal female goddess, as they do within Christianity. You know, all of these images of Madonna and Child are simply exactly the same veneration as Isis and Horus is exactly the same.
You've shown images in one of your books that showed the remarkable parallels between the two, if I remember right.
Yeah. It's a strong element within my books that the religion has not really changed since its original inception in Egypt. Remember, these people came out of Egypt. They were the Hyksos. They were venerating most of the Egyptian gods and goddesses. And this has gone through Judaism. It's been tempered, of course, by monotheism, but it's gone through Judaism and it's gone into Christianity, because I say that the Jesus character was more Egyptian than his Jewish colleagues. So I call his religion, he was a Nazarene Ebionite, and I say that his religion was Egypto-Judaism, because it had this strong Egyptian content within it. And the classic example of that is the great Zodiac at Hamat Tavera, which is on the Sea of Galilee. So one of the more astounding things of recent archaeology is that they've uncovered more than half a dozen, almost a dozen of these ancient synagogues. And all of them have a zodiac on the floor. A large, classic, exactly the same as we would have today, Greek-style zodiac on the floor of the synagogue. Which means that these particular people who owned these synagogues were not Jewish as we would understand it today. These were the Nazarene Egypto Jews who venerated the zodiac. And they held the secrets of the precession of the equinox and many other astronomical cycles and events that happen. And they were venerating the zodiac. This is the Hamat Tavera zodiac, I say, is first century, because Josephus Flavius says it was owned by Jesus of Gamala. And I equate Jesus of Gamala with the biblical Jesus. So this particular zodiac was owned by the biblical Jesus. And Josephus himself was sent by the priesthood in Jerusalem to go and destroy it. And he has this passage where he says he went to destroy it. But by the time he had got there, they'd burnt the place down. And I think that they burnt the place down in order to preserve the zodiac. Because the zodiac wouldn't be, especially if you covered it with sand or something, wouldn't be affected by the burning down of the synagogue. And it would be preserved underneath the ashes of the synagogue. The reason for burning it is because the punishment for Josephus was sent there because it had heretical images of animals on the mosaic. And the penalty, of course, was probably death for that. So it was much better to burn it down than be...
Is this because of one of the early Ten Commandments, no graven images?
Yes, you mustn't have any graven images. And this zodiac not only had images of animals, but people could venerate those images as well. And that had to be punished and quashed. But we know that they were doing this because Jesus himself was born as a Lamb of God, but became a fisher of men. And it just so happens that within precession, Aries turned into Pisces in about AD 10. So in which case, it's quite obvious that Jesus was following the precession of the equinox. This is how they identified monarchs in these eras. You could tell by their symbology which era they were in. So if you look during the era of Aries, we have the shepherd kings. They were obviously following Aries. We have Alexander the Great, who when he went to Egypt, he became a pharaoh of Egypt, remember. He has the horns of a ram in his hair. We have Moses had horns. We have the Ptolemy kings of Egypt. They all had horns in their hair because they were born and ruled under the constellation of Aries. But then as soon as we get to the first century, suddenly we get the Fisher Kings. And Jesus was obviously the first of the Fisher Kings. And we have this long line of Fisher Kings within Arthurian legend, which denotes the constellation of Pisces.
Notwithstanding the famous song from the 60s, this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. We are still in Pisces, I understand. Is that correct?
Yeah, we are. Yeah, they were correct, but they were a little bit early. I make it that Pisces changes into Aquarius in 2,350.
Which is quite a ways down the road.
Yeah, we got 3 centuries to go before we enter. Yeah, but they were slightly ahead of the time. Yes,
Obviously.
This is the dawn of the age of Aquarius. Yeah.
This is an amazing thing, the importance of the zodiac in the religions that, I grew up in, and most people grew up in, Christianity and Judaism in the West. And the zodiac is all over the world in every major civilization. And we did come out of a ice age, was it 11,000, 12,000 years ago? So this zodiac fixation, do you have a theory about why they were so obsessed with the zodiac?
Well, you can use it for divination, for prophecy, of course. You can use it to amaze the royalty if you're the priesthood. You can say that certain events will happen, and lo and behold, they do happen.
You mean things like eclipses and so forth?
Eclipses and all of that nature, yes, if you understand the eclipse cycle and the lunar cycles. Right. But I think more importantly, it identifies the ages. So you can identify any particular event, any particular monarch within the last 10,000 years by the precessional sign that they're associated with. And the classic one for this, of course, is the pyramids being associated with the lion, with the Sphinx. And the Sphinx looks due east, seemingly looking for its partner in the night sky. And of course, its partner in the night sky will arrive, but only in 10,500 BC, a long time ago. So whoever created the Giza complex was pointing towards this era, 10,500 BC.
Isn't that about in the middle of the Younger Dryas?
Just at the end of the Younger Dryas. Okay. The Younger Dryas ended just at that point. Yeah, I'm thinking, because that's BC. So yeah, Younger Dryas was.
I thought it was 9600 BC.
12,
ended.
Yeah, I think the Younger Dryas. I'll have to look this up because I'm forgetting. I think the Younger Dryas was 12,000 years ago, which would be 10,000 BC. I'll have to look that up.
That's about right. That's what I understood too. It's about that.
We're talking about the same era.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have this. This great wonder of the universe, wonder of, the great megalithic architecture of the ancient world, which is pointing back to this era, quite pointedly so. And then we go through the ages, and we've already looked at this. We have the age of Taurus and the Apis bulls. We have the age of Aries and the shepherd kings. And now we have the age of Pisces and the fisher kings. It does seem that the people were using this throughout the ages to identify the age they were in. The only person who wasn't really was Akhenaten, who probably saw the problems of the civil war that they had in Egypt between the shepherds and the Taurians, between the Apis bull worshippers. And one of the ways of getting rid of those tensions and those civil wars was to destroy the images of the animals themselves. And so hopefully when you get to the division between Aries and Pisces, you wouldn't get a civil war. But you did, actually. It was called the Jewish Civil War, which I think was caused by the very same tensions. So I think that might have been one of the reasons why he promoted monotheism, was to get away from these images of the gods, because it was being too divisive.
His father was working on Otanism before that. I mean, his father, Amenhotep III, had been working on the idea as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, this was long after the change from Taurus to Aries, of course.
Right.
That happened in 1750 BC, and Akhenaten wasn't until about 1350 BC. So, but no doubt those tensions had existed all during that long era. And so as a way of getting over it, I think he decided to go for monotheism. But that's a sort of side story. But this veneration of the zodiac has been a constant of, I think, probably all religions. They've evolved recently into different formats. But if you look at, say, Mithras is quite obviously the constellation of Orion. So the Mithratic symbol is this person who's killing a bull. That is the primary symbol of Mithras. Mithraism, I should say. And it's quite obvious that that character is Orion, because he's posed in exactly the same fashion, killing the constellation of Taurus, which lies right next door to Orion in the night sky. And that's the symbolism you get in this image of Mithraism, is Orion killing Taurus. So again, it's indicating the change from Taurus to Aries in 1750 BC.
There were quite a few
and
churches
we get the same
in early Christianity that were built on Mithraic worship centers, right?
Yeah. They took previously sacred places and they built Christian cathedrals on the top of them. They did the same in England, where they built them within henges and so on. But this also goes back into Persia with the story of Gilgamesh. If you read the story of Gilgamesh, that's quite obviously the same story as the Mithraic Orion. Gilgamesh is Orion, and his task is to kill the bull of heaven, Taurus. But before he can do so, he has to get rid of the Humbaba. And the Humbaba are the 6 splendors of the Humbaba, which guard the neck of Taurus. And of course, if you look in the night sky, the 6 splendors of the Humbaba are quite obviously the Pleiades, which sit on the neck of Taurus, protecting its neck. And you've got to get rid of Pleiades before you can stab Taurus in the neck and then bring on... I'm going to have to...
We probably should wrap it up pretty soon. I should mention that your explanation of this was very good. I liked it a lot, though I wonder, to what extent do you think the story of Gilgamesh was telling a story about a real king, and what was it encoding information about the zodiacal change, the precession of the equinox?
all of these things can be dualistic, of course, because the gods were imitating what happened in the heavens, as above, so below. And so you could have a real king who says, we're at the junction between Taurus and Aries, and I am the king. I am Orion who will kill Taurus and bring in the age of Aries. So it could easily have been a real king who was mimicking the events in the heavens above, as above, so below. It's the old adage of all of these early religions, that they were a part of the cosmos above. As Abraham said, you will become stars in the heavens above. You will become a multitude. This happens time and time again. So yes, it doesn't have to be strictly just astronomy. It can be events on the ground.
This way of looking at the world and the meaning of the world is very different from the modern age. It doesn't seem very much like how I came to be when I left my religion I grew up with and became a secular humanist, which is, something I did when I was young. And I just didn't think like that. And it's been quite a mind expander to sort of reach back into the roots of our civilization and actually make some sense of what's been going on.
Yes, because the way religion is taught is it's about veneration of a god. And your personal relationship with this God. But that really wasn't the topic of most ancient religions. It was the veneration of the cosmos and your part in the cosmos. But these greater gods would not necessarily be looking after the petty problems of man. You might have a lesser demigod might look after you and your family, but, what the main gods were doing were nothing to do with you as the general public. They were for the realms of the priesthood down in the temple, because they were the only ones who could converse with the real gods. And if necessary, you could pay the priesthood to converse with them on your behalf, which is how the priesthood managed to get their power. And this was reinforced later, I think. Maybe it was always like this, that the king himself became the messenger, the Simon, the angel. Angel just means a messenger, an ambassador of the gods. So the king became the ambassador of the gods. And if you wanted something, you had to go to the king, and he would petition the gods on your behalf. That's how earthly monarchs got their power.
Well, that's certainly how Akhenaten portrayed himself, but he didn't seem to have a great deal of contact with... I don't see him doing a lot of service to his population. Did you see that?
No. He didn't mingle with the general public. He gave out awards occasionally to his...
Okay.
There's images of him giving awards to his trusted aristocracy. But yes, he wouldn't mix with the common people. I mean, this was the whole problem with him and Nefertiti always being naked. You know, the two naked lovebirds in the Garden of Arten, which we now call the Garden of Eden, of course. He was very much removed from the general public. And when they were kicked out of Amarna eventually, they had to cover up and put clothes on, as it says in the book of Genesis. So, yeah, the Garden of Eden within the Genesis story was the Garden of Arten. And remember that the Arten itself is spelt with the reed glyph. And the reed glyph is more of an E than it is an A. And so the garden of the god of the Arten was actually the god of Eden. That's how it would have been pronounced. And we know that this all happened in Egypt because Genesis says that a river flowed out of the garden, and from thence it was parted into 4 branches. And there's only one river that does that, and that's the Nile. And it ran through the garden of the god Aten, and then it was divided into 4 branches in the Nile Delta. And we doubly know that this is what they were talking about because the God of the Israelites was called Elohim, Yahweh, Shaddai, and Adon. So the God of the Israelites had the same name as the God of Akhenaten himself, because the god Aten was either called the Aten or he was called the Adon. And that is the God of the Israelites. So we know that he is closely connected with this story of monotheism within the Israelite story. And that's a whole nother book to go through, that one.
Yeah, I read that one. That may be the first thing I read of yours.
Possibly,
after that piece on the Ice Ages.
Yes, I've written so many. So for listeners out there, I've written all about the Old Testament in what I call the Egyptian Testament series. So that's Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs, Tempest and Exodus, Eden in Egypt, and then possibly the one behind you there, Solomon, Pharaoh of Egypt, which we've not even touched on at all. And then I write all about the New Testament because I rolled into the New Testament. And it's now a trilogy in 4 parts. So this is the, what do I call this one? The King Jesus Testament. And that's Cleopatra to Christ, King Jesus, Jesus King of Edessa, and the Grail Cipher. And then there's 2 extra books that tap onto that. So there's Scota, Egyptian Queen of the Scots, which follows Scottish history, which says that all of the Scots came from Egypt. And then there is Mary Magdalene, Princess of Orange, which says that Mary Magdalene went to Provence in France and her exploits there. So there's a lot of reading there. There's at least 10 books. and some of them are quite fat as well. So King Jesus and Jesus, King of the Pharaohs, are both sort of 600 pages each. And they are well argued, I'll have to say myself, with a lot of interesting information. And it's all new information that you will not find in any other books. Whether you agree with it or don't agree with it, it's entirely new, entirely original, very logical, because I write not from I'm not religious. I have no particular dog in this fight. I'm just looking for the absolute truth. So whether you agree with my conclusions or not, it is new truth that you've probably not heard of, for the many reasons that we've been through already in this talk, that people don't talk about the truth. You're not allowed to talk about this and that. It's taking a lot of mythology and putting it back into history, because again, people will say, oh, that's mythology, I'm not going to look at it. I take a deep dive into it, and I find that a lot of this mythology has elements of history within it. I do that for the parts of history that fall off the end of biblical literature and Josephus literature, where you literally have to go with the mythology. But if the mythology makes sense, I tend to view it as more historical than straight mythology. If there is a rational reason for it being told in that fashion, and it seems to equate with what history teaches us. With, for instance, the exile of Mary Magdalene from Judea to France, there is an amount of information that is consistent in saying that might be true. And so I run through that and see what the truth of that is.
But you can sort of see why you scare people. I mean,
yes.
Because I think a normal academic person doesn't get to make this many revisions, right? It's just not allowed them, right?
Yes, I'm revising the whole of biblical history all the way from Genesis to Revelations, which might sound as though it's impossible and therefore what I'm saying is false. But no, it is possible, because as we've said before, people won't touch this material. And as I said to a eminent priest who was reviewing my book, no, was it him? No, it was to a historian. And I said, look, if you found this scroll in a pot dating from 3,000 years ago, and you found it in Egypt and you pulled it out and it had the biblical text on it, you would look at it. You would go through each verse, each word, trying to find history within that book. But because you've found this book in a church, you won't touch it with a barge pole. So how are you ever going to correlate religious texts with historical texts if you never look at the religious text, which they don't? And conversely, for a theologian, they very rarely look into history. They just sit there looking at the biblical text. And so it takes someone independent like myself to be able to actually put these two different texts together to see where they mesh. And
you've had to take risks.
They can't do anything.
I mean,
it's not a risk to me, you see.
But it is a risk for normal people out there.
Yeah.
Just like it's a risk to say that masks don't work like you think they work. It's a risk.
Yeah.
And so,
if you're in the medical establishment, yes, it's a risk.
I mean, there have been
But if you're not in the medical establishment, I can say it.
Yeah.
And that's the advantage.
Though you may get kicked off of YouTube. So people have been kicked off of YouTube.
Well, I have. Yes, on a couple of occasions, I've been kicked off Facebook and YouTube, and I've managed to get myself back again.
Oh, have you? So you have experienced firsthand our current cancel culture.
Oh, yes, very much. Yes, very much so. And I got kicked off Wiki 4 times.
I gave up on Wikipedia years ago because I saw leftists take it over.
They did.
It's astounding.
And I got kicked off Richard Carrier's blog as well. Richard Carrier is this famous theologian who has very strange ideas, and I was arguing against him.
Well, he's a skeptic. I mean, he's a skeptic.
Yeah, Yeah, I wonder that myself. Yeah, I wonder if he's a skeptic or not sometimes because he seems like a Mormon. He has a lot of Mormon friends, and I'm wondering if he's a Mormon in disguise.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I had this argument with him, and he called me clinically insane and deleted me from his blog. And the funny thing about that is his blog is called the Free Thought blog.
Yeah, I know. It's very weird. This culture we're living in, it has so many strange things. But one of the things that I have been objecting to for the last 4 or 5 years has been the professional skeptic, which we have a number of famous ones, because they don't seem that skeptical to me. That is, they seem to be defending orthodoxy more than they're defending a method to find truth, or to not be. Well, we're not talking about Pyrrhonian skepticism. None of them are Pyrrhonists, so we're a long ways from that.
Yes, I've found that as well, especially with the carrier types and these Mormons. There was a group of Mormons who tried to trash my books, and they were fairly disgusting, actually, in some of the things they were trying to do in order to denigrate, not my work, but trying to denigrate myself, because that's always the great way of the left, is they don't play the ball, they play the man, and they try and trip you up, not what you said. And so, yes, I had quite a contention with these people, and they were trying to destroy my works in order to prop up Mormonism, but they were doing it supposedly as historians. Oh, we're not doing this because of Mormonism, honest. We're just doing that because we're historians and you're wrong. But no, they were doing it because they were committed Mormons.
Okay.
And I took them to task on that because some of the beliefs of Mormonism, of course, are very, very, very strange indeed. Especially the Abraham document, which is the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
Oh.
And everybody knows it's the Egyptian Book of the Dead. But, of course, Joseph Smith said it was the Book of Abraham. And I was trying to get them to defend the Book of the Dead as being the Book of Abraham. And they were going round and round in these circles trying to not agree that their books of Mormonism were completely wrong. They were Egyptian. Anyway, that's a side story, but that's the sort of that's the sort of opposition and denigration you get. And yes, people like Carrier, I do wonder if he's an atheist, really, from what he says. He seems to be defending religion more than he's trying to denigrate it.
Yeah. There's a lot we could argue about, and I have a lot of questions for you, but we've been at it for over about 2.5 hours now, and your voice is going. I suspect that
is a little bit.
Mercy might be my side if we called a halt to this.
Yes. We've got lots to go through. We've not even touched the New Testament yet. So, yes, if your viewers and readers like this, then we could come back and do the New Testament at another time.
Yeah, I'd love it.
We've got at least 3 hours of New Testament work.
Right. I'm only about a third of the way into King Jesus right now.
Okay, yeah. So you're getting to grips with some of it.
Yeah. I'm one of the great things about reading your books is it's, once again, like I said, it's got me back to read somebody I hadn't read in a while, which was Josephus. And
yes.
He really is one of the most fun historians who's ever written. Partly because he's obviously a liar half the time.
Yes.
So there's that. And that makes it kind of, there's a little frisson there.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, he was paid by the Romans, and so you get this distinct Roman slant through everything.
Right. And we need to talk about the star prophecy, but not today, as they say.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Okay, well, I really thank you. This has been great. Your books have challenged me more than any other books this year. I read a fair amount of books, and I've really been enjoying yours. I don't know if I agree with everything, but that's not the point. I have expanded my mind, and I think that readers would really enjoy dipping into your writings. I really highly recommend it.
Yeah, well, even if I'm only right, 70% of the time, I've still overturned the whole of the traditional view of the Old and the New Testaments.
And I should mention to my few, I don't have a really large readership or a following yet, but they would be interested in your discussion of left and right in the battle between Ottanism and Aminism.
Yes.
That was a fascinating discussion, and I've quoted it to people, and they were blown away. So,
yep, there's lots of asides, to people who haven't come across these books. I have the main thrust of the argument, and then lots of little branches which have interesting asides on them. And each one of those is quite fascinating.
Yeah, and just left and right.
Yeah.
That's actually politically relevant to walking out the door right now with or without your mask.
Yes, it is, yes. Yeah, it does. It carries through into the modern society, and I like to do this every now and then within these books, is point out how this relates to modern society. So it's not just fossilized in history. There are lots of elements that are still with us in the modern world. So yeah, I do like pointing that out.
And that was probably my favorite of them all, because it really it's right up my alley, because I have my own theory of left and right. So really helped me articulate a few things. So I really, really greatly appreciate that. Okay.
Glad you enjoyed it.
Okay. I'll talk to you again sometime.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
Cheers.
Bye. That was another episode of Locofoco Netcast. My name is Timothy Verkula. You've been listening to Ralph Ellis talk about his research into the deep past and the not so deep, but still pretty ancient past, and talk about the relevance of these controversies to contemporary life. And they are relevant. I hope if you've listened to all 2.5 hours of this, you get an idea of why I invited him on. I guess I should mention, to remind some of my friends and relatives and so forth, that many ideas I explore in the realm of suspicion, not in the realm of belief. There are many things I don't have beliefs on. A lot about ancient history I just take as is, and then start revising it slowly, and then begin to doubt things, and then consider many different theories about what's going on. There's much about the ancient world that I find utterly mysterious, and I find the standard academic explanations to be not very convincing. They don't really incorporate all the data that is in front of us. And that's really one of the things I'm talking about here in my opening remarks, was that you don't really get to be proud in your opinions if you won't deal with all the relevant data. And I know we can't all find all the relevant data, but sometimes we have one big datum sitting right in front of us, and we still ignore it. And I don't think we should do that. And when it comes to global warming and climate change, I think this is really dangerous. So that's why Ralph Ellis's ideas are so important here. We are dealing in our time with a whole bunch of paradigms that are very weak. They're houses of cards. They're temples of cards. They're pyramids of cards. They aren't built on limestone and granite. They aren't carved with precision. They're jerry-rigged affairs, and they could easily come tumbling down. Well, I think we should reconsider and reshuffle the deck and lay out some new ideas and some old ones in a better order. And we should stop trusting the experts. We must challenge these people, because they get away with being very sloppy or careful in some details and then ignoring huge swaths of information. So that's my perspective on all this. I'm not really into beliefs so much of this. I'm into exploring my suspicions, because really my suspicions are more interesting than my beliefs, if that distinction can be carefully made. At some point, we'll have to discuss epistemology and epistemics in this space. But for now, I should wrap this up. You can find the Locofoco Netcast on a number of podcatchers. It's hosted at SoundCloud, but I have the handy URL, locofoco.net. You can find the team at locofoco.us, and you can go right now to locofoco.locals.com. And soon you'll be able to support this podcast. And maybe with some support, I can come out with a regular publishing schedule. Something I'm working on. Something for the new year. Happy New Year.